Hi, guys. Hi, guys. Thank you very much for joining us. We're very happy to have Dr. Sue Starfield with us. She's an emeritus professor in the School of Education. I'm sorry, you want to say something, Sue? So, as I was saying, Sue Starfield is an emeritus professor in the School of Education. She was the director of academic literacies. She was the director of the Learning Center at UNSW from 2000 to 2017. Her research and publications cover tertiary academic literacies, doctoral writing, writing for publication, postgraduate pedagogy, English for specific purposes, identity, in academic writing and access and equity in higher education. Dr. Starfield recently co-edited the Palgrave Handbook of Applied Linguistics Research Methodology 2019, her ethnographic perspective on academic writing, co-authored with Brian Poltridge and Christine Tardy at Oxford University Press in 2016, argues for ethnographic approaches to the study of academic writing. The second edition of her co-authored book, Thesis and Dissertation Writing in a Second Language, a handbook for students and their supervisors, appeared in 2020. She recently co-guest edited a special issue on the Journal of Second Language Writing. Is currently co-authoring a book on the evolution of PhD as an academic genre to be published to Bloomsbury. Two book series with Routledge in the field of English for specific purposes, Introduction to English specific purposes, and Research in English for specific purposes. She is a co-editor of the New Journal of English for Research and Publication Purposes. As you can see, we have just the perfect person for this workshop. So thank you, Sue Starfield, for your participation. And with no more delays, please welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Viviana, for that welcome. And it's my great pleasure to join you this morning. I hope what I have to share with you will be useful to you. But obviously, we're meeting for the first time, and I don't really know where everyone is at. So I've made my talk fairly general, and I'm really happy to try and also respond to questions that you may have. So I was going to introduce myself briefly. I mean, after your very amazing introduction, there's not much left for me to say, but I just thought I might talk a little bit about my experience as an editor of journals, because I've actually edited a few. Let's see if I can. So here are the images of the 3 journals that I've actually edited over the last decade or more. The first one on the left, English for Specific Purposes, is a journal where we look at how English is used in a variety of contexts, from academic work to professional communication. And this is a journal that's published by Elsevier, which is one of the so-called big 5 in international publishing. And there was a lot of support, and also that changed over time. And one of the reasons I stopped editing was something I might talk about a bit later. Then more recently, until the end of last year, I was an associate editor on linguistics in education, which is also looking at the role of language in education, which is another big Elsevier published journal, where I was an associate editor. At English for Specific Purposes was just myself and my colleague Brian. We edited that journal, had an editorial board. And then linguistics in education is really big and publishes a lot of papers every few months. There was 1 editor and 4 associate editors. So we were just dealing with a huge volume of papers coming in that we had to process in the crazy sort of world we live in now, where everyone's trying to get published. And this journal, the Journal for English for Research Publication Purposes, is one I'm currently co-editing with a colleague. And this is interesting because it's a brand new journal that we only started a year or 2 ago with John Benjamin's Publishing, who are a smaller publisher based in the Netherlands, and they don't have the huge global reach of a publisher like Elsevier. but they're actually really good to work with. You have human beings that you connect with, and they help you, and they do a great job with proofreading, and it looks really nice. And it's been very interesting trying to start a journal from scratch as opposed to a well-established journal like these two, which have been going since the 1980s probably, or and we had the great pleasure of publishing a paper recently by Viviana and colleagues on some of their work. So it's nice as well to have to build a journal, which is a new experience for me, and which is one of the reasons I took it on. And build a network, make people aware of your journal. And then, of course, when you're with a new journal, you don't have things like an impact factor. So in some ways, it's less attractive to people to publish in, but on the other hand, people want to build a journal, and it's an opportunity for many people. But moving on, that's just a little bit about my background and experience. And I also co-authored this book with Brian Poldridge, who's my longtime colleague. And we both had been editors together of English for Specific Purposes, and he'd edited another big journal in our field. And we decided it would be good to try and share some of the things we'd learned through that process with other people. And we did this small book with Michigan University Press, which, if anyone wants to find out more, there's a lot of more information in that little book. And this is another book that Brian and I have got a chapter in from editor's perspective as well. And there's lots of interesting articles there by well-known people, and others, if people are more interested in building their background knowledge. So why have I put up this slide about tacit knowledge? Many of you might have heard the phrase tacit knowledge or come across the concept. So it's an idea that explicit knowledge is just the tip of the iceberg, and that's what we can talk about and put into words and articulate. But then, in fact, a lot of our knowledge is tacit, and we don't really have a language to talk about it. And that's what I find when I talk about editing. I often can talk about the little tip of the iceberg and put that into words, but there's a lot of things I've learned over the years of editing that maybe if you ask me a specific question, I can respond to in a very particular context. But other times it's just all knowledge that I've acquired through immersion and doing things, that practical knowledge, that know-how. So I really expect and hope that you'll have specific questions that you want to ask me. And if there's something really important during the talk, just indicate that, or if something's not clear, please let me know. I might just start by asking you if you have any immediate questions or anything that you would like me to talk about. You can pop questions in the chat as we go as well. Does anyone have a particular specific question at this point? So these are some of the themes that I wanted to talk about in the course of, it's my morning, of course, it's early in the morning here. Fortunately, my dog barked at 6 o'clock this morning and woke me up. So I'm awake. I know it's later in the day for you. So thanks for being here. The reviewing economy is something I might mention. I'm going to talk about the multiple roles of editors, that we don't just reject papers, which some people might think. Some of what I see as my responsibility as an editor, your responsibility as an author, the writers, responding to reviewers, just go through some of the things that I think are interesting to think about. And then we might also talk a little bit about the role of the mysterious publisher, who I've alluded to. But moving on, why have I got this little image here? I like to think of reviewing as a kind of circle, a virtuous circle, if you like. And this is the ideal view. I'll tell you where this thought came to me. I was doing a talk a few years ago in the pre-COVID era, and a student in the audience put up her hand and said to me, "How much do reviewers get paid for reviewing journal articles?" And this led to a long diversion, and I explained how it all worked, that reviewers don't get paid anything at all for reviewing. It's a gift that we give as academics, as scientists. We review papers because we anticipate that when our papers are submitted, other peers will review them. That's why we talk about peer review. So in a way, the idea of reviewing, editing, etc., is a really nice thought. But of course, it gets complicated. It's never that simple. So we should always be thinking of, if we get asked to review, or at some point I'm going to be looking for reviewers, and what if my paper, they can't find reviewers for it, or don't get good reviewers. But of course, in the world in which we're living now, where there's so much pressure to publish and so many people are submitting to so many journals, it doesn't always happen as neatly. And then we've got editors like myself, and I'm also a reviewer sometimes for other journals and from papers that people submit to my journal. And then I'm trying to get my own work published too, so I'll be an author. So these roles keep circulating. And then there's this person, this company, this corporation called the publisher, which exerts all kinds of power on the world of editors, reviewers, and authors, particularly in trying to get us to publish large volumes of papers, because publishers are making money from our work. So that's one of the sort of ironies in the whole thing, is that reviewers and authors aren't recompensed other than through rewards like institutional rewards for getting published in prestigious journals and all that kind of thing, getting a PhD at the end of the day. Those are the intrinsic rewards, if you like, but there's no financial rewards. As editors, we typically get a small honorarium every year from the publisher, just to help us. And when I was at English for Specific Purposes, we actually used to use our honorarium to pay copy proofreaders to proofread all the articles, because the publisher Elsevier was not doing that at all. And in fact, most big journals don't do that. They don't do any copy editing or proofreading, which we'll get back to in a minute. Anyway, that's just by way of introduction to the whole area, the idea of this economy or reviewing karma, where we've got to always keep reviewing and giving feedback and writing in order to keep the whole thing going. Is it right? Is it just? There's a lot of talk these days about that the system isn't fair because reviewers are doing all this work for no rewards. You get very few institutional rewards for reviewing. I mean, it might be a line on your CV or your promotion application that you've reviewed 10 papers in the last year, but it's not really going to help you. And yet the whole system relies on the goodwill and commitment of reviewers. So now let's talk about the editor. The editor is a kind of ringmaster who has to orchestrate all these different aspects. And in fact, a lot of people think of the editor as a gatekeeper, someone who keeps people out, rejecting, desk rejections. But the role of an editor is much more complex than that, from my perspective. Editors are also, there is a gatekeeping role. Of course, the editor, in my view, is the custodian of the journal. We are in charge of it and responsible for it for the time that we're there, and we want to build it. And we also want to help people, like particularly new writers, established writers, get published, get their article to be the best that it can be, find the perfect reviewers who are the ideal readers of that article. All those are kind of ideal things. It doesn't always work out like that. So we're mentors and mediators between the author, the reviewer, the publisher. We can be shapers of a field because we have a particular vision of what we think are the important issues. We can try and, through the role of editorials and other online social media, try and shape the field, look for emerging issues, have special issues in which we focus on key themes that we think are important. So we're disseminating information. We're trying to improve and enhance the work that comes through to make it the best it can possibly be. So editors are doing all these multiple things. So it is quite a demanding role. But basically, from my perspective, editors are really trying to do their best to help your paper get to be in the best shape that it can be. Because once it's published, it's out there forever, and you want to find your audience. So sometimes you haven't sent your paper to the right journal, where it's not going to find its audience. So that's one of the key things. So this is one of my favorite quotes. It's actually from a study that was done a number of years ago, where this colleague of mine interviewed journal editors as to why some papers weren't getting sent out for review or getting published. And this editor said something that I think is really valuable to think about. He said, one of the most important, I don't know if it was a he, this editor said, one of the most important things for any would-be contributor to a journal to do is actually to read the journal, because all journals have a style, a flavor, and I've highlighted that word flavor because it's sort of intangible, that idea of the taste of the journal, if you will. It is very important that if people want to publish in this journal, that they read copies of it and familiarize themselves with the sort of things that we published. So that's probably one of my number one tips as an editor, is to follow this advice. So often I get students or even colleagues coming to me and saying, I've written a paper, where should I publish it? In my opinion, that's going about it the wrong way. First, identify the journal that you want to send your paper to. Then you almost approach it like a little bit of research. Hopefully because you want to publish in it, it's a journal that you are already reading, that you're citing the work of scholars who publish in it. But you've got a sense of that flavor of the journal, the taste. What are the conversations? What are the key themes that people are interested in? So these are some questions that you could ask yourself when you're researching a journal and whether my paper is a good fit. Is this paper a good home? Is this journal a good home for my paper? Can you see your paper making a contribution to the conversations in the journal? And sometimes journals have a number of conversations going on at any one time or over a period of time. Ask yourself what it would be the contribution that my paper can make to these debates or conversations, to the research. What sort of arguments are authors making who publish in this journal? And then you can look at things as like how the articles are structured. How are they put together? Is there like a very standard way I can see they're doing it? Is there some innovation? Things like, are people using the first person when they write? Are they writing in an impersonal way? What are the typical sections in the articles? Are they, is it very standardized? Can I be more creative? Who are they referring to? What are the names of people? Who do I recognize? Are these names familiar to you? So it's almost like, would my work belong here? Would it be a good home for my paper? And it's really important to do that thinking, and then to really look at that journal, look at the last 2 years, look through the issues, see what are the titles that people are using. And then if you feel like, I don't see anything that really resonates for me, maybe you need to look for a different journal. And of course, if you're a PhD student, this is a conversation to have with your supervisor. You're probably co-publishing anyway, so they may have an idea. Sometimes supervisors from the beginning are saying, I think of, what about this journal, or what about that journal? This could be a good journal. And there's other factors to consider too, of course. I just want to look in my chat to see if there are any questions. So now I'm going to give you to sort of share some more tippy kind of things or issues that I see arising. So as I said, this is my number one tip, I think. I might have a few number ones. Be familiar with the journal you wish to publish in. So the biggest reason when I talk to other editors and read what editors write, sending to the wrong journal, so-called wrong journal, is the biggest reason for getting an outright reject. And that's what we tend to call a desk reject. So the reject before it goes out to review. And that's what you want to avoid. What you're aiming for is to get your paper sent out for review, because you've got a much higher chance, obviously, of getting it published if it's sent out for review. So it's important to do that prior work, that prior study, thinking through. So that's really the first question we ask when we see a new paper. So everyone's working with an online system. So we get an email that says there's a new submission or a new person has registered on your system. Then we see a paper come through. We see the abstract. We download the paper. We have a look at it. And sometimes from the minute you see the title, you realize it's the wrong journal. If I'm editing English for specific purposes and I see it's an article on English fiction in the 19th century, I know they've just seen the word English in the title. It's literature. It's not suitable for my journal. Sometimes, a lot of the time, it's more complicated than that. So as one of the themes of my talk is going to be how difficult it is to find reviewers. And this is a case in which you can think about the reviewers. Our reviewers are very precious. It's getting harder and harder to find reviewers. So when I think about sending a paper out for review, is it going to be a productive thing? Is the reviewer going to want to read this paper? Am I wasting the reviewer's time? So those are all the questions in my mind. Is it good enough at a level that's good enough to send it out to a reviewer? Whether the reviewer accepts is another matter, which we might talk about in a little while. So you want your paper to get through those first hurdles. So one thing I might look at is there actual research that was carried out? Now, not all papers are empirical or research-based, I understand that. But is there, and in my journal like the Journal of English for research publication purposes, we have perspective pieces that they're shorter and they're more personal. They discuss an issue, not necessarily empirical research. So that would be something I'd look at, like what is the contribution of this paper? But is there some research that's talked about? Can I see evidence of an original contribution? So what would be the novel thing, the new thing? So sometimes in the abstract, the author signals that quite clearly. Sometimes in the introduction, the writer tells you in the conclusion, they might say this paper is significant because it's important because. So those are the things I'm like, look at the discussion to see what's new. I look at my overall impression of how readable this paper is. Has the writer taken care to edit it? There are not a lot of mistakes, typos. It's to a greater or lesser extent, it's following the guidelines. Now, all journals have guidelines, and if you're submitting to a journal, you should definitely look at the guidelines. Often, they're not that helpful, in my opinion. Like if I look at the guidelines for some of the journals I've edited, they're not necessarily that helpful, but it is a good idea to look at them and to the extent that you can is follow them, because that is what the expectations are of the reviewers and the editors. It doesn't mean you have to just have a sort of carbon copy and you can innovate, but it's a good idea to not completely disregard them. The word length is important, even in these days when journals are mainly online and you don't have print copies. In the olden days, when we had paper copies, it was really important not to exceed the word length, because as editors, we were given a number of pages we could have for the entire year. And we couldn't really go over that because of the costs to the publisher. These days, there are very few print copies. Some journals, I think, have given up completely on print. And so it's easier to have longer articles. On the other hand, what I will say is that, say my journal's 8,000 words. If you send me a paper of 9,000 words, I'd probably send it out for review. If you send me a paper of 15,000 words, I'm going to send it back to you. And I'm going to say, please shorten this paper, because from the reviewer's point of view, asking them to review a paper of 8,000 or 9,000 words compared to 15,000 words is a lot more work. So something to think about. The bigger problem that I have experienced is being under the word length. So you send me a paper that's 5,000 words as opposed to 8,000 words. Something's going to be missing from that paper. There probably won't be enough research. You haven't discussed it. The results will be probably not that significant. So another thing that people may not think about is don't have a paper that's too under the word length. Oh, this is another very important point. Are your references current and relevant? One of the first things that as an editor, if I've decided I'm sending the paper out for review, or even before, I will look to the references. And because broadly I know the field quite well, I might not know the specifics. If it's a big journal like Linguistics and Education that goes across a lot of subfields, I won't be across them all. But I can tell, like if they're key authors that you haven't mentioned or cited, that's a trigger warning. I need to look into this more deeply. So current and relevant, what does that mean? A few years ago, I asked a colleague to give a talk to our students about being an editor and writing for publication. And one of the things that he said, so it's a few years ago, so at that point, it was probably like 2015 or so, he said that for his journal, if you don't have references after 2010, he won't accept the paper. So I don't think all editors do this, but current means quite current, particularly if your topic is one that's being discussed right now and it's not a historical paper. Make sure you have some up-to-date references. Of course, you can't neglect the key references in your field if they go back to the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Don't discard them, but make sure you're up to date. So you keep reading and you're citing the latest research to the extent that you can, because that could be something that editors will look at when considering whether to send a paper out for review, is just how up to date it is. It used to be hard for people in countries outside the center because you couldn't access the journals, or the universities couldn't afford the journals. I think it's easier these days because of online journals and multiple ways of, you can write directly to people. There are many sites where you can access papers, write to authors and that kind of thing. Formatting is important. It's less important probably than it used to be, because the journals now with online systems can easily reformat your paper. But nevertheless, if you get, particularly in the sciences, if you're told to format in a particular way with particular sections, particular headings, subheadings, do that. Have you used the journal's referencing style? This is just one of my pet peeves. I like to get a paper in APA, which is the referencing system we use, American Psychological Association. But the journals tell us that it doesn't matter. Most of the big 5 journals will say it doesn't matter. You can submit in any referencing style you want, and they've got a system that just reformats it. So I've tried to be more tolerant these days of different referencing style. Another thing I might look for is this question of, where's your contribution? Is there a results or discussion section where you actually show how you're contributing? So what's new, what's novel that you're adding, which is typically where I expect to find it. And it's interesting there's been research because publishers can track people online and see what they click on. So what would you think the most commonly viewed, do you think people open an article or download an article and they start at the intro and read the whole way through in a linear way? Well, think about how you read an article. You probably don't. We tend to look at the abstract and the title, decide if we want to read it. The intro we might read because that's where we're getting introduced to the whole argument of the paper. And then often people skip to the discussion. So the intro and the discussion are often the most read parts of the paper. So it's important to craft those and work on them to get your arguments really clear, because and then people may go, if they're really interested, they may go back and look at your methodology and your results to see what you actually did. And at the same time, other research has shown that intros and discussions are the parts of the writing that we typically as writers find the most difficult. So that is more challenging. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about what goes into an introduction in a short while. Oh gosh, I have a lot of things that of my peeves. Have you author blinded references to your own work? Now, I hope everyone knows what I mean by author blinded. It does vary according to journals, and some journals these days are practicing open peer review, where the reviewer and the author can know who each other is. But I think that's still the minority of journals. So the key thing in peer review is that you're anonymous. The reviewer doesn't know who you are, and you don't know who's reviewing you. And the idea of that is to promote fairness. So you're not being judged on your name or what you've published. So what that means is, if when you submit your paper, you remove any references to your previous work and you just put author and date, and you remove any citations to your work in the reference list. And then, because you won't know who's reviewing you, and you'll never know if you're with one of my journals. And that's what we call double-blind peer review. So when you're looking at the journal guidelines and they say, or instructions to authors, if they say we practice double-blind peer review, please remove all references to your previous work and just put author and date and put that in the reference list. You'll have an opportunity at the end, if your paper is accepted, you reinstate all the details. So the idea is just to promote better fairness, really. And sometimes there's single blind peer review where you may be known to the reviewer, but they aren't known to you. And so this is some sort of change in this, but I would say on the whole, we're still going with author blindness. It is considered to be fairer because there is research that indicates there's sort of bias towards women and people from minority groups in reviewing if your name is known. So it is meant to protect people. And it's not a perfect system, but it's a system we have at the moment. A lot of people are arguing for open peer review, which can be done online, and everyone knows everyone else. And I think there are arguments in favor of it. So I feel like at this stage of publishing, everyone should kind of be aware of author blinding. So, but I still get papers regularly that haven't been author blinded, and I'll always send them back to the author. So it just means a bit of a delay in getting your paper. I won't reject a paper, of course, but I would send it back to the writer and say, please author blind your work. And that can delay things a bit. So those are some of my tips and the things that I look for. Now, how do you find reviewers? This is one of the biggest challenges as an editor, and it can drive one quite crazy, particularly since COVID. It's become harder and harder. So sometimes we send out reviewers through the invitations, through the online system. It's meant to help. There's a big database where people have their keywords and we can search it. I honestly never find it that helpful. But firstly, you look at the editorial board where we have specialists in various fields, and I look to my editorial board to see who might be a good reviewer for this paper. People on my editorial board might be on a number of editorial boards. They're reviewing for other journals. So you never know if they're going to be available, if they're overcommitted. Everyone's struggling with huge workloads. People, if they're on an editorial board, they do mostly feel a compulsion or a sort of requirement to do some reviewing in the year. But sometimes they've agreed to review for another journal. They're just hitting a busy period with teaching. They're away on holidays. All these things happen. Sometimes on our editorial boards as well, we have people who've been there for 30 years. And because they're a well-known name in the field, we don't want to take them off the editorial board, but they really never accept an invitation to review. So there's all these things that you kind of learn. But really finding reviewers is my most time-consuming task. And sometimes I'll go up through 8, 9, 10 invitations to find a reviewer. And that means a delay for your article as well, because I'm trying like over several weeks to find a reviewer. So if I can't find anyone on my editorial board because I feel I've asked them too many times or they've said no, how do I go about finding reviewers? The place I mainly look is in your reference list. And I suspect other editors do it too. Who are you citing? And that's another reason why it is important, depending on your field, to have reasonably current references. Because if every one of your references in the 1980s or the 1990s, there's a good chance those people aren't active anymore in the field anymore, they're even alive. And I look to see who you're citing the most, what work has been cited. Could I approach them? Sometimes I'll know who they are. Sometimes I've never heard of them. Then I have to go online and search for them, find their institutional email, set them up in the system so they can be a reviewer, and then send them a very polite, non-threatening invitation. Sometimes tell them a bit about the journal. And then you wait to see if they go. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you get a pretty quick response and they accept. Sometimes it takes weeks. Sometimes you might end up saying, I sent you an invitation a week ago and I'm just wondering if you've had time. Over the holidays in the summer, the northern summer, it was really hard to get reviewers because I got endless out of office messages saying I'm on holidays. And some people responded when they came back, others didn't. I just waited. And it meant a delay, of course, for you as an author. If you're submitting a paper, it's just taking that much longer. But because it's so hard to find reviewers, I regularly get reviewers saying, I'm sorry, though the deadline is past, but I'm so busy, can you give me an extension? And I'm always going to give an extension because it's so hard to find another reviewer, but that means a delay as well. So if your citations aren't up to date, that can be a problem. It's very difficult to find reviewers. Some journals and more journals are asking for author suggestions. It may be the case in the sciences. I see a question.
That was my question. I understand finding reviewers is one of your major difficulties. How long do you wait for a response?
I'll usually wait a week or two because sometimes people don't respond immediately. But if after like 2 weeks I haven't heard, I'll probably give up. Sometimes I said, and you see, the other thing is the system sends out most systems, like the big ones that I've worked with, they send out automatic reminders. So you don't want to pester reviewers too much because they're getting, a reminder of the request to review. Then once they've accepted, they're getting reminders. Your review is due in 2 weeks' time. Your review is due in 1 week's time. Your review is, everyone knows that it's like that. But and we can't control them. That's one of the issues with the publishers, is that we can't control these messages. And often they are written in, I don't know if people that are here this morning have received these emails from publishers, but they're written in a most bizarre style. Before I send out a letter to ask a reviewer to review, I actually spend quite a bit of time editing the invitation, because if I sent it out as it is, I think people would be totally turned off, because they kind of a mixture of like very formal language, very informal language, quite rude at times. So I try and be very polite to reviewers. But at the same time, I don't tell them they're the most wonderful person in the world, which some of these letters do. So I'd wait a week or two just to see, because if people get back, sometimes the invitation ends up in their spam. It's hard to know.
How does the community react to author suggestion?
How do I react as an editor? Because they'll come to me. I'm a bit negative about them because I'm thinking, why have you suggested this person? But I think it's a result of the difficulty of finding reviewers. So sometimes I will, if I'm desperate, look, if an author's made suggestions, I will consider them. But it does worry me that it undercuts the blind peer review process. But I think the journals are starting to ask for this, because particularly since it seems from what I've read that during COVID itself, when everyone was locked down, we weren't struggling so much to get reviewers. But since COVID, there's this as you know, there's this sort of global exhaustion in what's been called a great resignation in other areas. Like in Australia, there's this huge shortage of workers in every field. And I think with reviewers too, there's this kind of fatigue issue of finding reviewers has really become huge. And I don't know what the long-term implications will be for publishing. If any, we just have to see. But it's something, I'm on a few lists with email lists with editors, and it comes up a lot, is how do you find reviewers? So these are some of the dilemmas that I, as an editor, that I thought I'd share with you. So what is a desk rejection? When do you do it? So a question that I've probably addressed already is just how, as you would know, most journals publish their acceptance rate and their rejection rate, and these are issues in the awarding of impact factors and all these things that I don't really want to go into the metric side of it. So we can't accept everything. And I think in terms of protecting reviewers and possibly redirecting you to another journal, I mean, sometimes I'll say this, you might consider X journal because it could just be a better fit for your paper. And sometimes people just haven't put the work in to get their paper to a level that's really acceptable to be sent out for review. And I think sometimes that's inexperience. People haven't had enough guidance, or they haven't read the journals enough to understand the level that the work has to get to. So these are some of my dilemmas. The finding reviewers is definitely one. And I spent a lot of time, honestly, searching for reviewers. It's almost like a research activity in itself sometimes, trying to find a reviewer. And I put in a link to this article in Inside Higher Ed, which was about the peer review crisis and the problems it's creating. It's a 2022 article, just if anyone is interested in reading about it. Another issue that I fairly regularly face is, all the journals that I've edited have 2 reviewers. There are journals that go for 3, or some that even go for 4, which makes it more complicated. So what happens if I get one review that says accept with minor revisions and one that says reject? And that happens sometimes. Mostly we get a fair degree of like minor revisions, major revisions, which you can work with, because one person's minor revisions could be another person's major revisions. Just depends on the person, what particular category they choose. We typically have reject, minor revisions, major revisions, or revise and resubmit, depending on the journal. So that's where the editor has to actually make an intervention to decide what recommendation to give the writer. So if one person's rejected the paper and another says accept with minor revisions, I really have to look at it very carefully. I have to think who the reviewer is. I have to look at their feedback, what they've said. I have to decide whether would I reject it. If I get to that point that I would reject it, then I'd probably reject it. If on the other hand, I think that with the feedback, the author could potentially improve the paper, I will give them that opportunity to revise and resubmit. It's really going to come down to how I read the paper and how I look at the feedback. Sometimes reviewers really don't give enough feedback, or they obviously haven't spent that much time on it and they just reject it, in which case I would probably discount the reviewer's comments and look at the other reviewer. What I sometimes do as well is I go for a third reviewer. If I really can't figure it out, I'll try and approach someone else. So all these things potentially, of course, delay the final response to your submission. So be aware that this could be going on behind the scenes. I think more and more in the online system, as the submitter of the paper, you're getting feedback of where depending which publisher you submitted to, you're getting feedback about where your paper is in the state. Like, is it still under review? Is it with the editor? That kind of thing. So then this sort of subset of the reviewer's discrepancy is when you give the author feedback from, say, both reviewers, and the reviewers seem to be just saying things that are contradictory. And then the author writes to you and says, can you please help me? I don't know how to respond to the feedback because reviewer X is suggesting this and reviewer Y is suggesting this, and I'm not sure. So then I also have to take a deep dive into the paper, and I have to really try and figure out what advice to give them, which is very challenging. And that's something that if you get that kind of feedback as a writer, I think write to the editor and ask them for their advice, and hopefully the editor can provide some guidance. So that's another of the roles that editors can play, which are the sort of mediating, mentoring sort of role. I added this. It's a challenge as an editor. What a colleague of mine called request purgatory. When you've written, that's the thing we were talking about. You've written to to a reviewer. Sorry, you write to a reviewer, and the request is sitting there in the inbox, and they're not saying they won't do it, and they're not saying they will do it. So how long do you wait before contacting them again? Some people say then I should go outside the system and just email them directly, because maybe when they see an email coming from an editorial system, or it gets caught in their spam filter. So there are various things you can do, but at a point you just give up and you say, I'm never going to hear from that person. I need to start the whole process again of finding a reviewer. Most journals have guidelines for reviewers, which you could probably write them yourself. They're fairly predictable. Is a paper making a contribution? Are there results and discussions? Is there evidence of research? How is it the written quality of it? Do reviewers follow guidelines? Probably most don't. They probably think they know enough. A colleague of mine did a study actually where he asked reviewers how they learned to review. And it's interesting because there's no real formal training for reviewers. We learn to review by reading reviews that we get. If people share their reviews with us, we learn how to review from that. It's again this tacit knowledge thing. I mean, one or two of the people in the study said, oh, my supervisor when I was doing my PhD was an editor, and they would share reviews with me, or they would put me on as a third reviewer, and I kind of learned on the job how to review, but that's unusual. So it is a skill set that as academics and colleagues, we kind of need to develop, is how to review. But we've only got a sample of the reviews we've received, really, to learn how to do it. So it's an issue more broadly, I think, there isn't real training for reviewers. And I think that's where the reviewing karma comes in too, is that think about giving the kind of feedback you would like to receive that would be helpful for you, but reviewers don't always do that. And then the issue of copy editing for me is a big issue because, as I said, the journals that I've worked on, they do the formatting, they do the referencing, put it in the right referencing style for the journal, but they don't actually edit, look for mistakes, typos. Benjamin's the current journal that I'm working with. They are probably the best I've experienced. They send us 3 rounds of proofs. So we check the proofs 3 times, send back feedback, they correct. They're really good. That is highly unusual. Working with Elsevier journals, when I first started out on English for Specific Purposes, they used to send, this is me complaining, they used to send us they send the author the proofs. So as an author, you will get proofs of your paper and you can edit them and correct them. And there's an online system now for Elsevier journals, which I found horrible. But we, as editors, we used to get the proofs, and then I would get my proof editor, who I was using my honorarium to pay. She would read through every paper and she would edit it, like a language edit, making it clear. Then I would read it through and I would do any additional editing. And then they stopped it because it was taking too long. Was slowing down the process of getting your paper published because they stopped sending us proof copies. And that's pretty much when I stopped editing for Elsevier, because I thought it was really a bad step. I really don't like seeing published articles with lots of mistakes and errors and typos. I like them to be the best they can be. So I actually spent a lot of time copy editing any paper for the Journal of English for Research Publication purposes. I like it to be in the best shape possible. So before I accept any paper, I actually edit them, and I did it for linguistics and education too. Now, not everyone's going to do it. I've got a particular background in language and writing, and I've got a degree of expertise. On the other hand, big issue is if a person is not a native speaker of English, or even if they are an English native speaker, they might have idiomatic ways of saying things, particular expressions. To what extent do you edit them out? And I think over the years, I've become much more accepting of the idea of English is a language spoken by everyone. It's a lingua franca. Everyone has to a greater or less extent, publish in English language journals, whatever we think of it. So I'm certainly a lot more tolerant of diversity in writing styles than I used to be, but it is something that's personally important to me, to make the paper as readable as possible. Another thing that I often get asked about is you've sent so much feedback from the reviewers that I need to respond to. My paper is now blown out. It's 2,000 words longer. It's 1,000 words longer. What shall I do? And really, because everything's online, it doesn't matter that much these days. I'll just, do it. Don't make it 15,000 words, but a couple of thousand words is not going to be a huge problem from my point of view. There might be other journal editors who think differently. So then let's get on to the writers. So everyone who's here now, let's think about what you need to do to get your paper published. I've spoken about what the editor does. What are the responsibilities of the author? So the first thing is to make your paper as readable as possible. It's going to be read by an editor, by reviewers. You want them to understand what your contribution is, what you've done. So we're wanting to write what I call writer responsible text. And to me, this is really important. Your job is to guide the reader through and help them. So what do I mean by writer responsible text? So some years ago, a colleague did this research in which they categorized languages. well, they really put them on a continuum between languages that are more writer responsible and languages that are more reader responsible. And it's an interesting idea to think about. So if your language is considered to sit on the writer responsible end of the continuum, it really is your responsibility as a writer to make it very clear for your reader exactly what your writing is doing. So you guide them through with clear introductions, you use connecting words like firstly, secondly, that kind of thing. You have shorter sentences, you have paragraphs where the main point is at the beginning of the paragraph, then you have supporting sentences that back that up. If your language is more situated towards this end of the reader responsible continuum, it's considered actually a bit insulting to do all that structuring work and guiding and signposting for your reader. The reader has to do more work. It's their responsibility to make sense of what you're writing. So I found that useful because, just a little bit about me, I actually studied in France and wrote in French in the early part of my career. And I almost had to relearn academic writing in English when I moved back into an English medium context. So French, I would say, is much more reader responsible. You have longer sentences. You don't do the signposting to the same extent. So languages like Spanish could also sit more at this end of the continuum. So be aware that in English academic writing, there is more of an expectation of the writer's responsibility to guide the reader through and help them with this sort of signposting. So look at articles that are published in your field and see to what extent this might be going on. So it's important to have an overall structure and argument. Now, I don't know, Viviane, if people are familiar with the Swales and Fee Creator Research Space Framework. Has anyone talked about it? I can't hear. I think you're muted.
Yes, I'm sorry. Like very superficially, not quite enough.
Okay, so can I spend a couple of minutes
yes, absolutely.
introducing this idea?
Absolutely.
These colleagues John Swales, a colleague of mine, years ago, he was teaching academic writing, journal article writing, and what he did was he collected a huge number of articles, scientific articles that had an empirical research component, and he studied the introductions, which, as we know, is the more difficult part of the paper to write, and you've probably all experienced that. And he said he found these 3 moves. So a move is just a thing you're trying to communicate. And the first one he called establishing a research territory, which is these are the things the writer does. We try and argue, usually in the opening paragraph, that this general research area we're studying is important or interesting or problematic, relevant in some way. We call that your claim centrality. So you say the topic of X is extremely important or, significant, relevant. And then you would back that up by introducing and reviewing items of previous research in the area. So that's when you do a bit of a literature review. In the introduction, you might go on to have a separate literature review in the paper, or that might be your review of all the previous studies that have been done. So that's showing that there's interest in the topic. It's important because other people have studied it. But then in move 2, you typically establish a gap or a niche. You've heard of the gap, the idea of having something that hasn't been studied and that needs to be studied. And that's when you say X has written this and Y has written this. However, very few studies have looked at, or little research has been done. It doesn't have to be a huge thing. And it's not always a negative. It could be building on previous research, identifying a need, raising a question about previous research. And then typically in the final part of the introduction, you've created that niche or research space. You've argued that there's still work to be done, and then you show how in this study you outline the purposes stating, or this study will, or this study aims to. You outline your present research, your aims, objectives. And typically these days we preview our principal findings and we state the value of the present research, why it's important, worth reading, worth studying. And often what people will do is preview the structure of the paper, are firstly going to do this, then we're going to do this, then we do this. Not every time. So these two things that I've highlighted in red are becoming more common. So typically in academic work, we're quite modest and humble, and we don't big note ourselves or boast about how incredibly important our work is. We're quite modest, but it seems from more recent research that it's becoming more and more common to actually state the significance of the study or the importance of the work in the introduction. So as almost a preview, you announce it. And I think it's basically because of the competition to publish, particularly in these high-ranking journals. Everyone's under pressure to publish from their PhD, to get promotion, all sorts of reasons, building an academic career. So we need to be more upfront about how our work is contributing and valued. Now, it also seems from studies that I've read in my field, where writing for publication, that in English language publication, this is definitely something that people are doing. People are writing in other languages, and the studies I've seen in Spanish and Portuguese, if they're writing in those languages where the field is maybe less competitive, you're finding less of this. So say you've been writing in Spanish for local journals, you might find stating the value of your work to be a little bit brash, and maybe that you're overstating your own importance, but look at the journals in your field. Do a kind of analysis of the introductions and see if they follow this pattern of establishing the research territory, identifying a niche or a gap, and then occupying it. And do they preview their principal findings and state how, to some extent, their work is valuable? Because that could be a guideline in terms of putting together something that is meeting the editors and the reviewers' expectations. Because that's often where people fall down and where we get into the desk reject sort of stage, or the reviewer rejecting a paper, is because the reviewer has a set of expectations in their head about what a journal article should look like. And if it doesn't, for some reason, meet that, that's where they're going to start looking at it more closely and wondering, is this acceptable for this journal? Okay, good. Going back here, and I've just put in a link to another online resource that explains the CARS framework in more detail if people are interested. So here's a typical bit of feedback from an editor that talks to this point of there's a set of expectations that readers have, reviewers and editors. And this is a case where the reviewer or the editor articulated the expectations and said, your article is not sufficiently located within current scholarship. Readers and reviewers expect the literature on which research articles are based to be as up-to-date and state-of-the-art as possible. So that's that part of the first move, establishing the research territory, where you need to survey the literature or in a literature review section. That's missing. So the editor sees a big gap, and the paper's probably not going to go forward on that basis. The other thing that's your responsibility, I think, is to really give it the best edit. So once you've really figured out what you want to say, either you do it yourself, get a friend to look at it, maybe you're co-authoring with someone, your supervisor, get them to read it through, look at all these things. Sentence structure. Do I have sentences that are like this long? Can I cut them down? Do I have paragraphs that are just one sentence? We really don't like a one sentence paragraph. Can I combine it? Do I have main points in the first opening paragraphs? Is it clear to the reader what the logic of my argument is? Have I followed the referencing? All this kind of editorial work, invest in it upfront, because it's going to work for you in the long run. Because this is a big turnoff for editors and reviewers if it looks sloppy, because there's this, sloppy presentation. Maybe the research is a bit sloppy as well. So they start to read it differently. I've put in a link to this fantastic site, which you might all be familiar with. It's called Academic Phrase Bank. It's a huge database that an academic in the UK put together. They analyzed a huge number of PhD theses and journal articles, and they provide, it's not plagiarism because it's not actually the content of people's work. It's sentences, bits of sentences that are commonly used in academic writing. So if you're struggling to particularly find English ways of saying things, like how to be critical, how to compare and contrast, how to define terms. You can go on the site and see all these different bits of language that you could try out in your own writing to help it sound more academic. And they've got language for that CARS framework of how to introduce your work, how to occupy the niche, and identify a gap, all that kind of thing. Anyway, I'll just close that down and go back here. So the other thing, the feedback from editors, is that a paper isn't addressing an international readership sufficiently. So, the idea of whatever an international journal is a contested kind of idea, and we could debate it, but this is some of the feedback that editors do give and reviewers, that the paper hasn't addressed an international readership sufficiently. So it's too limited to the local context if you're trying to publish in a so-called international peer-reviewed journal. So I've put a link here to a blog by Pat Thompson. I hope some of you follow her post. She's terrific. Her blog is called Patter. And here you can read the whole piece here. They're short pieces. She's very prolific. She publishes every week something to do with academic writing. It's usually interesting and valuable. So you need to look at, in the abstract and introduction, how your paper frames your issue more widely. And it could be just connecting to the more international literature, or saying that the issue discussing has got more global ramifications. So also in terms of when you discuss the implications of your research, you could link it to a more global international context, and also connecting to other studies to show you're aware of the wider debates of your issues. These are all things you can think about. Have I internationalized my paper? Because you could get feedback saying this is very interesting for this specific context, but I would like the writer to consider, the wider implications and how it could be relevant to people in other places and locations. So this is just a visual representation of the typical structure of a journal article. And again, and this is why I'm introducing it here, is to just give you this idea, reinforce this idea that reviewers and editors have a kind of expectation in their minds of what a journal article should look like. Now, it's not writing by numbers, it's not a formula or a recipe, but this is the general structure of a journal article with empirical research, that we're moving from the general to the specific, back to the general. So the introduction, this hourglass, it's called the hourglass model. So it's broad at the top because you're connecting your research into the broader field. Remember, you're saying why a problem is important, you're reviewing relevant literature. So that's where you connect to the broader context. But then you begin to narrow down, get more specific, identify your gap or research space, state your research aim to fill that gap. What are your research questions? But it gets very narrow here because you're describing the methods that are specific to your study. And then the discussion is where you connect your study back to the wider field. So the intro and the discussion are almost mirror images of one another. And this is sometimes we find we get papers that don't have a discussion section, and that's when we'll send them back, because you need to discuss your findings in relation to the field. And you should be citing literature in the discussion as well to show. In the beginning, you discuss the literature and introduce it to identify your gap, what still needs to be done. But here you've done your study and you're showcasing your contribution. So the discussion is and conclusion are the places where you are really showing how I've done this research. This is what I think it contributes. These are what I think the implications are. Here are my recommendations for further research, which we typically do have, and the broader implications for the field. So once you've got that idea in your head, I think you've got the key parts of what a journal article's doing, the work it's doing, and that can help you meet the expectations of the reader and the reviewer. Another thing that's important is you make claims. So remember, you've done research, you've collected all this data, you've got results. You're going to start commenting on your research, on your results, your findings. It's always an argument. Writing a journal article is never just a description of what you did. It's always an argument a case you're making for your research and its validity and reliability. So you're making a series of claims, and everything you've done, the data you've collected, the analysis you've done of it, it becomes evidence to support your claim. So you're writing to persuade the reader that this is an acceptable study, everything looks above board, you've actually done the work. What claims can you make? So one of the key things we see in reviewer feedback is writers being asked to justify their claims through their data, through citation. You get phrases like this: the author should explain why. That's indicating that you haven't provided sufficient evidence. You've made a claim based on your study, your findings, but it's not strong enough. You need to provide more evidence. You need to explain why. You need to link back to other studies, perhaps. And we often get this language as well. I think that some of the claims in the paper need to be better supported, for example. So that's something that as a writer, you need to consider what the evidence is for claims you're making. What's considered sufficient evidence, what's appropriate. And again, through reading papers in your field and looking at things, not just at the content of the paper, but how writers are setting up their claims, that's going to help you as well, because every field does things a bit differently. So the other problem is that people overgeneralize, and this is something reviewers are very aware of. You make claims that are too sweeping based on your research. So often you need to actually be a bit cautious about your claims. So particularly in the social sciences and humanities, we tend to, because it's not like the sciences where you can kind of prove or demonstrate something, particularly when we do qualitative research, you can only suggest things based on your findings. So you'll find words, what we call hedging words, which are more like imply, suggest, could be seen to, seems, is possibly, whereas in the sciences, you tend to find more definitive language used. And also, as I said, avoid too much description because you are building an argument. So my next slide is actually a table based on research into this language of academic writing in different fields. And it sort of clearly indicates how the language varies according to the field. And that's something as well as a writer to be aware of when you're a responsible writer. So they did a study that compared so-called harder sciences like biology, physics, elec, and medicine with the softer sciences, the social sciences. So what are the top reporting verbs? In other words, verbs where they reported on other people's work or their own work. So if you look at the sciences, you see the top words are described. In biology, develop, propose, show. And in the second word is, the most used word was find, report, use, report. So report comes up a lot. So it is a bit more descriptive. Describe, demonstrate, show is another one. It might find my results show. So you can make that kind of claim because you've done some sort of experiment or you've done some sort of quantitative study. But when we get to the social sciences, the language is actually quite different. Look at suggest, the top word. Suggest is the second most used word because of this issue of not being able to definitively claim something. Suggest, note, report is there a little bit. Find, argue comes up, whereas you don't see argue at all. I would argue, studies argue, so-and-so argued. So again, it's important to be very much in touch with what is the language most commonly used in my field, particularly as a novice writer and a learner. As I mentioned, we tend more and more to highlight the contribution of the study, not overly modest. So how do you highlight your contribution? One thing, as I said, every field does it a bit differently. So it is important for you to look at articles in your field and see how writers are doing it. So highlight what's significant, be modest about it, include key work, even if it's written a long time ago, if it's really important for your argument. Just as I said, discuss your findings in relation to the field. That's where you begin to signal your contribution. Remember to relate it back to literature. Did you actually do what you said you would do in your introduction, in your paper? I mean, is your paper reading coherently? your introduction and conclusion should really talk to each other. So the questions you've raised in your intro, you should be able to respond to them in your conclusion. And can you really support your conclusions with the claims you've made? There's a couple of other things I wanted to add from an editor's perspective again, mostly. So quite often I get desperate letters from people who've submitted papers. I really need to get the outcome of my submission to your journal because I need to publish in order to graduate, and I have to have a publication. I'm applying for a job, I'm applying for promotion, I'm applying for tenure. When can I expect to get a response? Is my paper being accepted or not? As I've said all through this talk, there's really little control that as editors we have over this, because I've explained all the things that can happen along the way to delay publication, to delay you getting a response. So you really need to think ahead. If you are in one of those situations where I need to publish 3 papers before I can get my PhD or before I apply for this job, submit your paper well in time in order to give it the best chance. Why is my abstract important? Why do you think an abstract is important? Because that's what we send to the reviewers. When we ask them if they'll review your paper, what they get is the abstract. They're making a decision on whether to review your paper based on your abstract. So make sure your abstract is actually giving the best take of your paper, highlight what is new, how you're contributing, make it clear what you actually did within the word limits. Then when your actual article, it should actually follow the argument in your abstract to the best it can, because often the abstract is very clear. I find the papers sometimes go on a wandering path and they lose the focus. Don't waste your title. Title is also what the reviewer sees, and the editor. So the editor is also looking at your abstract, but we can look at the whole paper, but the reviewer's making the decision only based on the abstract. They only get to see the paper once they've accepted, then they get access to the paper. So the title and the abstract and maybe the keywords, I'm not sure. I don't know if they see the keywords. These are important things. Avoid double submission. This is like the biggest no-no in the academic publishing world. Only submit to one journal at a time. So people have that idea sometimes if they're not that familiar with the world of publishing. If I submit to 3 journals at the same time, my paper's got a better chance. Bad idea, because I can send your paper to Viviana to review it, but so can the editor of another journal, because Viviana is an expert in this topic. So we both ask her to review it. She then realizes she accepted to review it from journal number 3. She writes back and says, no, I'm already reviewing this paper. I've heard editors say that person will never publish in my journal again. Will never ever publish in my journal, will never publish again, because it's considered really bad manners to do that. So even if it's taking a long time and you're not that happy, don't send it somewhere else. If you want to send it somewhere else, you're really not happy, withdraw it from that publisher, from that journal. Just say, I'm withdrawing my paper. You can do that and then submit it somewhere else. Okay, so often I get asked, somebody's like, I haven't heard from this journal for so many months. What can I do? Should I write to the editor? As a rule of thumb, I'd say if you haven't heard within 3 months, you haven't heard anything, you can't see online where your paper is, after 3 months, it's perfectly okay to write to the editor and say, I'm just wondering what's happening. They should respond to you. Also remember that, the thing of commenting on the limitations of your paper, very, very important as well, is writing the resubmission letter. So you get reviews, they're not terrible. They're asking you, the reviewers are asking you or suggesting that you do various things. The editor's given you the opportunity to revise and resubmit or make major revisions, whatever the journal's categories are. You're going to spend a long time doing that, thinking about it. One of the things you must do is write a letter in which you respond to every single comment of the reviewers. Sometimes, as I said earlier, they can differ. And sometimes you can actually highlight that in your response. Reviewer 2 said this, reviewer 1 said this is what I've done. So the best way to do it is through a table, which I'll show you in a minute. And it's very, very common to get asked to revise. This is the most common category, revise and resubmit. I remember once being in a talk with editors, and one editor said they've never had 3 reviewers say publish immediately. I think it's happened to me maybe once as an editor. I had sent a paper out and both reviewers came back and said accept the first time around. Typically, we go through at least in 1 round of reviews, sometimes even 2, depending. So if you get revise and resubmit, which is the biggest category, it is not reject. I know I've heard stories of writers thinking they get revise and resubmit and they can't look at their paper again and they're just devastated. That is actually a good result. You're giving an opportunity. They think there's merit in your paper. Revise and resubmit. Just do it. Put it away in a drawer for a few, a mental drawer. Come back, get someone else to look at the feedback, talk to your supervisor and respond. Edit your paper, revise it. Always be polite. Always thank the reviewers for their feedback, even if you're devastated by it. Here's some examples of stuff I've received where people very politely thank the 2 reviewers and they talk about the changes. And there's when a reviewer, the feedback didn't meet their expectations. The reviewer said, although some of my comments have been incorporated, there is still a serious weakness in the results and possibly their presentation. Because the authors have not given a point-by-point response to the initial reviews, it is not possible to know why some comments were responded to and others not. So again, the reviewer expects to see a detailed response. You didn't do it, they're not happy. So I've got some comments of Mark that we received as authors and the way we responded, just to give you an idea. So here, this was feedback on paper we did some years ago. So there's been research that indicates that reviewers tend to be quite polite in their feedback. They tend to not tell you to do things directly. You have to figure it out, what they want. Is it a command? Is it a recommendation? Is it a suggestion? And sometimes we may not pick up that what a reviewer is suggesting is actually a command or a recommendation. They want you to do it because of language, that hedging language. So it's something that we need to think about. When they suggest things, it means you have to do it. They might say, it would be nice to see. That means they want you to do it. So here's a comment from a reviewer, a well-written and presented article, which has something to contribute. My main recommendations have to do with adding a broader contextualization and toning down at least a little some of the claims made. So you see, they thought we were over-claiming, making claims that were too broad, probably. So they wanted us to tone it down. And then recommendations. What does that mean? We need to do it, or you're just recommending it? Possibly we could do it. We responded and so is this a recommendation or an instruction? We interpret it as an instruction. We have provided a broader contextualization while attempting to remain within the word limit. So we tried to give ourselves a little bit of protection. We're saying we didn't want to make the paper much longer. And we said we have narrowed the scope of our claims. So we very focused. The paper was eventually published, so I think we did meet the reviewers. And here's another comment. We recognize that it is an instruction to modify some of our claims. The reviewer said, so the reviewer does it in the first person. I'd be a bit more cautious in talking about the history of doctorates in the performing arts, unless you have thoroughly checked the sources. So again, it's cast as a fairly polite suggestion. Be more cautious. I'd be a bit more cautious. We said we have tempered our claims. We've modified our claims that we made when talking about the history of doctorates in the performing and visual arts. Our point about there being no well-established tradition is clarified below. So we interpreted what could be seen as a suggestion as an instruction. And again, we modified our claims. So I think that's just something to think about in really reading the reviewers' comments carefully and to see if they're actually asking you to do something, and they'll be upset if you don't. So I've got a few examples of other comments which you might think about. These are from real reviews. So the reviewer said, below are some references to intercultural communication I suggest you familiarize yourself with. So the reviewer's suggesting in a polite way. You could ignore it, just a suggestion, but I think they're actually wanting you, recommending or instructing you to do it. It's just the way we politely communicate in reviewing language. It would be worth citing a more recent volume. They want you to do it, or it's just a suggestion. I think they want you to do it. The author provides no conclusion. Where is your conclusion? Put one in. I was expecting to see one. I suggest that the claim be removed unless it can be warranted by more convincing data. So again, you see, I suggest about a claim you've made, you take it out unless you can provide more convincing data. So that's what you really need to do. So this is I'm always at the end of my talk. I just want to stress the importance of persevering. As I said, revise and resubmit isn't reject. So revise, resubmit. People have identified what they call authorial persistence as a key factor in publishing success. And I've seen it with so many friends and colleagues who are very successful. One of the key things is that they never give up. They look for another journal. If they get a reject, another journal, revise the paper, submit it elsewhere. So just keep persisting. And here's an interesting little statistic. So TESOL Quarterly is one of the leading journals in my field. It's very highly rated and so on. So the editors did a little study and they found out that in 2014, 75% of the authors who made revisions had their article accepted for publications, which is high, 75%, much higher than the acceptance rate and rejection, complete reversal of the normal rejection rate. Revising and resubmitting actually increases your chances of getting published significantly. So revise and resubmit is not reject. And then I just put in a little blog, a link to Pat's blog, where there's a guy who was rejected, I don't know how many times, and he persevered, and he finally got his grant or his paper accepted. And he's got a table showing every single rejection he got until he finally got published. I can't remember how many it was, but it's worth reading. It's kind of inspiring, just the way he persevered. Finally, I just go back to the editors and finding a journal. I'm sure you've all heard of these so-called predatory journals. You probably get spam every day inviting you to submit a paper and telling you that your paper can be published in 2 weeks. The journal has got all these famous people on board as editors. Be very careful. There are a lot of dodgy journals out there, these so-called predatory journals. This Beals list does have a list of some of the better known ones. It's not a good idea as a new scholar to publish in these journals, even if they tell you you'll get your paper published quickly. Sometimes they don't send them out for review. Sometimes they try and extort money from you to publish in them. Really be careful, because if you've written a good paper from your PhD, it's your innovative, novel, significant work. You want to get it in an established journal that is well regarded by your peers. This is another good site which has got a bit of advice, the Think, Check, Submit. It's got resources for identifying predatory journals. So just be a bit cautious and always talk to your supervisor and to colleagues and peers. They will know better what's going on in your field. To conclude, I've just put in a couple of links to articles about open access, which is a key topic now. Everyone's talking about open access. This article is really interesting because it shows how open access isn't necessarily reducing inequality in global publishing. I won't go into the details of it, and this one as well, about how these big five publishers actually control the majority of journals. And they're making huge amounts of money, these publishers like Elsevier and Taylor and Francis and other publishers, through what is largely the free work of us as an academic community through our reviewing and our editing and so on. So it's just interesting to understand the bigger picture. Sometimes not everyone's going to be interested in that, but I put those links in. So now we've got a bit of time for questions. I haven't exhausted everyone.
What a great talk. Thank you very much. I absolutely agree. Knowing what's going on behind the scenes of the publishing industry, it's been really, really helpful. And I hope our students find it useful. Guys, you I open the floor for questions. Please, just if you raise your hands. We have some questions here. Let me see. Yep. Angelina Herrera, please. Thank you. Yep.
Okay. Can you back your 3 slide, please? I interesting for me this information and I want to analyze more, please. If possible, can you back to a slide?
Just
3 or 4
Which
slides?
slide?
Yeah.
Which slide? That slide?
Other, please. Other one. Yes,
That.
this, please. Okay. This part is maybe interesting for me because sometimes when I express, it's important to be polite.
When you are
Yeah.
responding to the reviewers, right?
Yeah.
It is important to be polite, even if you're feeling angry with them. Is that you just need to thank them for their feedback and say it was helpful. And then, so the point I didn't make, what I think most people do now is do the table for review when they respond to reviewers. So you've got the reviewer's comment on the left and then how you've responded on the right. And put your detailed response in here. It's very helpful to the reviewer when we send your response back to the reviewer with your revised paper, and we ask them if they'll be prepared to re-review it. And most reviewers will agree because they've given you a recommendation of revising and resubmitting major revisions or minor revisions. So then they have to read the paper again and see to what extent you've responded or how you've responded. So it's really important. This helps them at a glance see. Some reviewers these days are also sending their papers back with track changes, which is useful because people are so used to working in track changes. I think they find it easier to do that. So we can, through the online system, we can send the paper back to you as the author with the track changes in.
Thank you so much.
Paloma?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Shu. It was very interesting. And I don't know if you can share a little, if you want, about your first paper that you submit. How was your experience and what can you remember? Or in general, can you give some tips or advice?
The very first paper I ever submitted to a journal was rejected. And I think I did put it in a drawer and I was very devastated. And I don't think I ever published that paper or sent it anywhere else. But things did improve over time and I got more confident, but I certainly lacked confidence. I think I didn't feel that I had anything to say and I didn't really, because I started publishing in the 1990s probably. So before there was this immense pressure to publish as well, and it wasn't journals as there are now. So I still find it stressful. I tend to write with colleagues now more, which I think is nice. It's good to, if you're doing a team doing research or working with colleagues, then you can support each other and share the writing and read each other's, divide up the work a bit. And so if you're in the sciences, I imagine many of you are in teams or groups. So I think that can be good. I've also been, I recently wrote a paper for the first time with one of my students, which was interesting. She's graduated and we wrote a paper based on some of her data together, which I really enjoyed doing. But yeah, I think even being an editor doesn't necessarily make you feel more confident about your own writing or your own papers. You still go through those same feelings of people will realize that I'm an idiot and when I put words on a page, that kind of thing. So I just encourage you to,
Okay, thank you.
Do it.
I just submit my first paper maybe 2 weeks ago, and now I just realized that I have to be more pay attention in some issues that I didn't realize. But now it was very worthy your talk, and thank you so much.
Do you know if it's been sent out for review or not?
Well, they haven't replied, but I just work very hard the last month, and some of my research group, my teachers, review several times, but I open again my draft and I say, oh no, I think I can do this better, right? But
okay. It's a you never stop learning, really.
Yes.
That's the good, exciting part about it all, I think. And, hopefully you can pass on that to your own students one day. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paloma. Great to hear that. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue, for your presentation. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Fine.
okay, thank you. So thank you for your presentation. I think that was the best moment for me to see it, because right now I'm writing my first article. So I will I will use your presentation to get it the best possible. But I have one question about the recommendation or the instruction of the reviewers. What is the best behavior to have when several reviewers give us exactly opposite instruction, not even recommendation, but instruction? What is the best way to deal with that?
Well, as I said, you can approach the editor and say, I wonder if you can guide me, because reviewer X said this and reviewer said Y, and I don't know how to respond. So that, I would say, is maybe the first step, and see if the editor can. And look, often as editors, we see the reviews and we see that there's maybe contradictory things being asked. So sometimes as editors, we actually write, when we respond, when we send the paper back for revisions, we give feedback. So you'll often get actual feedback from the editor as well, which gives you a guidance on what to do. So hopefully you have an editor, if you are in that situation, you have an editor who can guide you and suggest, like, focus on this and don't focus on that, or try and do this, depending on how well the editor can understand the issues. We don't always fully understand a particular paper if it's very specific. Alternatively, when you do your feedback like this and you're responding, you can actually say, well, the reviewers had different interpretations and I've decided to do this in response. So you actually address the issue. You address the issue.
Okay, thank you very much.
Response. Yeah, hopefully you're not in that situation.
Okay, hopefully not. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Sue. Alina, please.
Thank you so much. Hi, Sue. It was a very interesting presentation. I have one question. If my article has been accepted 8 months ago and has not been published yet, what do you recommend me to do? And it's common for an article to take so long to be published?
It does sound a bit unusual to me. Have you had any correspondence with the journal? Contacted you?
Yes, but I haven't seen a response to that journal.
But they sent you a letter saying it's accepted.
Just a letter to say it's accepted my paper, but it's not another letter.
You haven't been sent a proofs of your article to review? They haven't sent you a copy of your article?
No. Just being accepted, and that's all.
That is strange. I would contact the editor or the manager. Sometimes journals have a managing editor or an administrative person you can contact, or who did the acceptance letter come from? The letter that said your paper's accepted, who did it come from? The editor?
Yes, the editor.
I think you write to the editor and say, would you mind, thank you for this email, could you update me about the status of my paper? Just something like that.
Okay, thank
you.
you.
Definitely contact them if it's 8 months ago, for sure.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Alina. Anyone else? So I found it very, very interesting, the role of the editor. I have an experience myself editing some volumes here at the university, and it's quite a task. Finding the right reviewer for a specific research paper, it's quite a task. And as you were saying, we're not getting paid. We might get some credit in our institutions, but at least in Mexico, we do not get enough credit for that. And I find that it's a very, very, not only time consuming activity, but very hard. I mean, you are helping another person to write the best version of their paper. It's exhausting, isn't it?
But editorial work is not highly recognized either in terms of institutional rewards like promotion or tenure and that kind of thing. You're expected to do this as part of your contribution to the field, but then there's not huge, and the publishers are aware of it. I think they try and do things like offer badges, but there's nothing they really can do to really improve the value of what you're doing in terms of the institution. Like, we're all expected to do these things. And please do, everyone here today, consider being a reviewer. Even as a student, might be that perhaps your supervisor can let you see reviews they're doing, or you can review an article that your supervisor's doing just as a practice exercise. It's really good to develop those skills, or volunteer as a reviewer for conferences, student conferences. There's lots of ways you can, and being a reviewer, I think, does help you develop your own writing ultimately as well. And being an editor, it can help you in that way.
Absolutely. And I would say, and I would add, to be generous to the author, right? To provide as much help as possible.
I know I often write a review and then I just leave it for a day and come back and try and read it in a more generous light, like a kind of, like when you examine a PhD or something like that, you might have a lot of comments, but then you come back and you sort of I put my positive thinking hat on and try and be more constructive.
I will use that expression now. Excellent. Anyone else, guys?
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here and inviting me.
So it was really a pleasure listening to your talk. We are really thankful. And if there are no questions, I think we are in time for us to call it a day.
Enjoy your evening, everyone, and thank you. And all the best for your writing.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.